The war elephant charged, the ground shaking under 5 tons of muscle and rage, tearing through the humid morning mist like a living battering ram. On its back sat a teenage prince, sweat stinging his eyes, his knuckles white around the handle of a curved blade. He was not just fighting for a crown, he was fighting to rewrite the cosmology of the universe. In front of him, perched on a rival beast, sat the man standing between him and immortality, his own great uncle, the reigning king. This was not a ceremony. This was a brutal, intimate execution in the middle of a screaming battlefield. The young prince, Suryavarman, drove his elephant forward, locking tusks with the older king's mount, the sound of ivory slamming against ivory echoing like thunder across the Cambodian plain. In a moment that would dictate the skyline of Southeast Asia for a millennium, the prince leapt. He struck down his rival, sending the old king tumbling into the mud of history. As the dust settled and the screams of the dying faded into the jungle heat, Suryavarman II stood victorious, chest heaving, covered in the blood of his kin. He did not look down at the corpse. He looked up, toward the heavens, and then toward the vast swampy horizon. In that silence, he didn't just see a kingdom to rule. He saw a void that needed to be filled with stone. He saw a mandate from the gods to build what was impossible. He saw Angkor Wat. But before a single stone could be laid, before the first chisel could strike, he had to conquer something far more dangerous than an opposing army. He had to conquer the water itself. How do you build a mountain of stone on a foundation of shifting sand and swamp water? How do you command an army of 300,000 workers, 6,000 elephants, and 40,000 skilled artisans to erect a structure so precise that it aligns with the stars, and so massive it consumes the entire economy of an empire? This is not just the story of a temple. It is the story of a man terrified of oblivion, an empire built on water engineering so advanced we are only just beginning to understand it, and the millions of nameless hands that bled to turn a fever dream into the 8th wonder of the world. To understand the madness of the undertaking, one must first touch the soil of the Khmer Empire in the early 12th century. The air here is thick, heavy with moisture. It wraps around you like a wet blanket. Smelling of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and the sweet smoke of cooking fires. This is a land defined by the rhythm of the monsoon. For half the year, the skies open up and unleash torrents of rain that turn dry plains into inland seas. For the other half, the sun bakes the earth until it cracks. In this environment, control over water is not just agriculture, it is power, it is legitimacy. The Khmer kings who came before Suryavarman II were not merely political leaders, they were Devaraja, god kings, intermediaries between the mortal realm and the divine. But their power was measured in hydraulic engineering. They built massive reservoirs known as barrays, artificial lakes that stretched for miles, holding the monsoon rains to feed the rice paddies during the drought. This mastery of water allowed the Khmer civilization to flourish, to feed a population that rivaled the biggest cities in Europe. But Suryavarman II wanted more. He did not want to simply maintain the reservoirs of his ancestors. He wanted to build a personal heaven. Most Khmer kings dedicated their temples to Shiva, the destroyer and regenerator. But Suryavarman was different. He was a devotee of Vishnu, the protector, the preserver. And for Vishnu, he needed a home that transcended anything built by human hands. He envisioned a representation of Mount Meru, the mythical home of the Hindu gods. Mount Meru is said to be a golden mountain at the center of the universe, surrounded by 6 other mountain ranges and vast oceans. Suryavarman pointed to a plot of land south of the existing capital, a vast expanse of forest and swamp, and declared this would be the center of the world. The challenge was immediate and terrifying. The site he chose was a floodplain. To build a massive stone temple here was architectural suicide. The weight of the sandstone would inevitably sink into the soft, waterlogged soil, causing the structure to crack and collapse within years. But the Khmer engineers, whose names have been lost to time, but whose genius rivals that of Da Vinci or Imhotep, had a solution that was paradoxically brilliant. They would not fight the water, they would use it. They understood that sand, when dry, crumbles and shifts, but wet sand, contained and kept at a constant level of humidity, is as hard as concrete. They designed a massive moat, a rectangular ring of water nearly 200 meters wide and stretching over 5 kilometers in perimeter. This wasn't just for defense or aesthetics. This moat was a hydraulic machine. It captured the groundwater and kept the water table under the temple foundation stable year-round. It acted as a corset, holding the sandy soil beneath the temple in place through hydrostatic pressure. If the moat dried up, the temple would collapse. If the moat flooded, the foundation would wash away. It had to be perfect. Imagine the scene as construction began. The year is roughly 1115. The jungle is being torn back. The sounds are deafening. The trumpeting of elephants dragging felled trees, the shouting of overseers, the rhythmic thud of thousands of hoes hitting the earth. The ground had to be prepared. Millions of tons of soil were excavated to create the moat, and that soil was piled up in the center to create the temple platform. But you cannot build on loose dirt. The laborers had to pound the earth, layer by layer, compacting it until it was dense enough to support millions of tons of stone. And then came the material. The temple was to be built of laterite and sandstone. Laterite, a clay-like soil that hardens into rock when exposed to air, was used for the hidden internal structures and foundations. It was ugly, pitted, and rough, but it was strong. It was the skeleton. The skin, however, had to be divine. It had to be sandstone. The nearest source of high-quality sandstone was Mount Kulen, the holy mountain, situated more than 30 kilometers away. This creates a logistical nightmare that boggles the mind. To transport enough stone to build a city-sized temple, they would need 5 to 10 million sandstone blocks, some weighing up to 1.5 tons. If they used ox carts on the jungle roads, it would have taken centuries. The empire didn't have centuries. The king was mortal. So they looked again to the water. The engineers dug a series of canals connecting the quarries at Mount Kulen to the construction site. They built a fleet of bamboo rafts. During the rainy season, when the water levels rose, the stones were quarried, loaded onto rafts, and floated down the canals to the building site. It was an industrial conveyor belt powered by the monsoon. At the quarry, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The air was filled with the sharp ting-ting-ting of iron chisels on rock. The workers used a technique involving wooden wedges. They would cut a line of holes into the rock, insert dry wooden wedges, and then soak them with water. the wood would expand, cracking the stone in a clean line. It was primitive physics applied on a monumental scale. Once the stones arrived at the site, the real artistry began. Unlike the Romans, who used mortar to bind their stones, the Khmer used nothing. Friction and gravity were the only glue. The stones had to be cut so precisely that you couldn't slide a piece of paper between them. This is where the rubbing technique came in. Two rough stones would be placed on top of each other and ground together back and forth until their surfaces were perfectly flush. It was a grueling, repetitive task that consumed millions of man-hours. Then, the blocks were lifted into place. But how? They had no pulleys, no cranes as we know them. They likely used a combination of ramps, elephants, and a sophisticated system of fulcrums and levers. As the towers rose, the earth ramps grew higher, burying the lower levels of the temple in dirt so the stones could be dragged up to the next tier. When the structure was finished, the dirt was dug away, revealing the mountain underneath. Let us pause and walk through the layout of this stone universe. You approach the temple from the west, a break from tradition, as most Hindu temples face east. Some say this is because Vishnu is associated with the west. Others whisper that it is because the temple was intended as a tomb, for the west is the direction of death. You cross the massive causeway over the moat. The sun beats down on the sandstone, which radiates heat like a furnace. You pass through the outer gopura, the entrance gate, and there it is. The symmetry is shocking. It feels mathematical, almost alien in its perfection. 3 rectangular galleries rise in ascending tiers, drawing the eye upward to the central sanctuary, the quincunx of 5 towers. The central tower rises 65 meters above the ground, anchoring the entire structure to the sky. But the stones are not silent. They are covered in stories. The walls of the galleries are lined with bas-reliefs, thousands of linear meters of intricate carvings. These are not rough sketches, they are high art. The most famous is the churning of the ocean of milk, a Hindu creation myth. It depicts 88 asuras, or demons, on one side, and 92 devas, or gods, on the other. They are holding the giant serpent Vasuki, wrapping him around Mount Mandara. They pull back and forth, churning the cosmic ocean to release the elixir of immortality, Amrita. Vishnu, in the form of a giant turtle, supports the mountain on his back. The carving is so detailed you can see the tension in the muscles of the demons, the serenity on the faces of the gods. It is an eternal struggle of the balance between good and evil, order and chaos, and it was carved by artisans who worked by torchlight, choking on stone dust, knowing that a single slip of the chisel could ruin months of work. Deep within the central sanctuary, the air changes. It becomes cooler, darker. The noise of the outside world fades. Here, in the heart of the central tower, a statue of Vishnu once stood. This was the Holy of Holies, the Axis Mundi. The king would come here to commune with the god, to merge his essence with the divine. It was a place of terrifying power. The layout of the central towers is designed so that from certain angles you can only see 3 of the 5 towers. It is a game of perspective, a manipulation of sight lines that forces the viewer to move, to circle, to engage with the architecture. And let us not forget the astronomy. Suryavarman's architects were also astronomers. The temple is a calendar made of stone. The measurements of the causeway and the galleries correspond to the lengths of the 4 Hindu time cycles, the yugas. On the spring equinox, if you stand at the very entrance of the western causeway and look straight ahead, the sun rises directly over the central lotus tower. It is a moment of perfect alignment, where the king, the temple, and the sun become one. This was not an accident. It was a statement that the Khmer Empire was in perfect harmony with the cosmos. But the construction came at a terrible cost. The treasury was drained. The rice paddies were neglected as farmers were conscripted into construction gangs. The forest was stripped of its hardwoods to build the scaffolding and the sleds. And yet the work continued. For over 30 years, the hammers did not stop. Suryavarman II grew old watching his dream rise. He saw the towers pierce the canopy. He walked the galleries, but he would not live to see it fully completed. He died around 1150, possibly in battle, possibly of illness. His death left a vacuum. The empire he had stretched to its breaking point began to snap back. Usually, when a king dies, his successor might halt the projects of the predecessor to start his own. But Angkor Wat was too big, too important. It was finished, or nearly so, by those who followed. But the story takes a dark turn shortly after his death. In 1177, the Chams, the sworn enemies of the Khmer from what is now Vietnam, launched a surprise naval invasion. They sailed up the Mekong, through the Tonle Sap Lake, and sacked the city of Angkor. The wooden palaces burned, the golden statues were looted. The stone gods looked on in silence as the empire collapsed. The people lost faith in the Hindu gods who had failed to protect them. Vishnu had not stopped the Chams. Shiva had not destroyed the invaders. From the ashes of this defeat rose a new king, Suryavarman VII. He was a Buddhist. He expelled the Chams and rebuilt the city, but he turned his back on the old gods. He built a new capital, Angkor Thom, and a new temple, the Bayon, dedicated to the Buddha. Angkor Wat, the masterpiece of Suryavarman, was slowly transformed. The statues of Hindu deities were replaced or reconsecrated as Buddhist figures. The layout, designed for the rituals of the Brahmins, was adapted for the monks of the Theravada tradition. This transition saved the temple. While other Hindu temples in the region were abandoned to the jungle, Angkor Wat remained a site of active worship. The saffron robes of monks became a permanent fixture against the gray stone. However, the jungle is patient. It waits. As the Khmer Empire slowly declined over the next few centuries, victim to climate change, changing trade routes, and the rise of the Siamese kingdom to the west, the population drifted away. The vast hydraulic network, the barays and canals that supported the rice harvests, clogged with silt. The water, once the source of life, became a breeding ground for mosquitoes and malaria. The wooden houses of the common people rotted away, leaving only the stone temples of the gods. But Angkor Wat was never truly lost. That is a myth invented by Western explorers. The local Khmer people always knew it was there. They continued to worship there. Japanese pilgrims visited in the 17th century and drew detailed maps. But to the outside world, to the rising empires of Europe, it became a legend, a rumor of a city of giants hidden in the green hell of the tropics. When Henri Mouot, the French naturalist, arrived in 1860, He wrote in his journals that the sight of the temple made him forget all the hardships of his journey. He described it as grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome. His writings sparked a frenzy of interest, bringing archaeologists, tourists, and looters. Today, if you walk through the corridors of Angkor Wat at dawn, before the tour buses arrive, you can still feel the ghost of Suryavarman's ambition. You can run your hand over the cool sandstone and feel the vibrations of the millions of chisel strikes. You can look at the bas-reliefs and see the faces of the soldiers who marched to their deaths for a god-king. You can smell the incense burning in the shrine, a scent that has lingered here for 900 years. The construction of Angkor Wat was an act of supreme ego, yes, but it was also an act of supreme faith. It was a civilization shouting into the void, declaring, "We were here, we mattered, we touched the sky." And in the end, despite the wars, the looting, the jungle, and the passage of time, they won. The stone lotus still blooms, the moat still holds the water, and the sun still rises over the central tower, exactly as it was meant to, indifferent to the empires that rise and fall in its shadow. But Angkor Wat was never truly lost. That is a myth invented by Western explorers. The local Khmer people always knew it was there. They continued to worship there. Japanese pilgrims visited in the 17th century and drew detailed maps. But to the outside world, to the rising empires of Europe, it became a legend, a rumor of a city of giants hidden in the green hell of the tropics. When Henri Mouot, the French naturalist, arrived in 1860, he wrote in his journals that the sight of the temple made him forget all the hardships of his journey. He described it as grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome. His writings sparked a frenzy of interest, bringing archaeologists, tourists, and looters. Today, if you walk through the corridors of Angkor Wat at dawn, before the tour buses arrive, you can still feel the ghost of Suryavarman's ambition. You can run your hand over the cool sandstone and feel the vibrations of the millions of chisel strikes. You can look at the bas-reliefs and see the faces of the soldiers who marched to their deaths for a god-king. You can smell the incense burning in the shrine, a scent that has lingered here for 900 years. The construction of Angkor Wat was an act of supreme ego, yes, but it was also an act of supreme faith. It was a civilization shouting into the void, declaring, "We were here, we mattered, we touched the sky." And in the end, despite the wars, the looting, the jungle, and the passage of time, they won. The stone lotus still blooms, the moat still holds the water, and the sun still rises over the central tower, exactly as it was meant to, indifferent to the empires that rise and fall in its shadow.